everyone. This is our first podcast for Ravens Rants or Ravings. I'm actually not sure what to call it yet. But everybody listening, I hope you feel like warriors, because the point of this podcast is to empower everyone to feel like you can step away from this podcast and do something in your community to change the world. The whole world. But before we can start, it's first important that we acknowledge where we are recording this podcast. We acknowledge Mohkinstsis and that this podcast is being recorded on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Wesley First Nations, as well as Métis Nation Region 3. And we are very grateful for the original stewards of this land who continue to be extremely gracious as we get to play and love and record podcasts and do all kinds of things on their traditional territories. This is our very first podcast, and I have Chris.
Hello!
Here with me.
I was in the neighborhood.
This is my partner, and we are sitting in our living room today. Our son is at school, and I decided to have Chris on because I recorded a few versions of these by myself, and I found myself devolving into extremely sad and negative spirals, and I just thought that maybe if Chris was here with me that I could keep things maybe just a little more hopeful, just as my sort of check and balance. How do you feel about that? You think you can do that?
I hope.
Yeah.
I thought I was a bigger bummer than you, but...
Most of the time you are. It's
okay.
True.
All right.
Yeah. Chris has a habit of posing like an existential crisis to me just before bed. And he'll be like he'll be looking at his phone really intently, and I'll be like, what? And he's like, well, I just found out that, and then he'll tell me about some devastating scenario that essentially means like the end of the world is coming really, really soon.
Insert serious existential threat, and that's, yeah. Good rules for relationships. Don't do that right before going to sleep, because there's nothing that you can do, and you certainly accomplish nothing when you lie awake worrying about it.
Yeah, you need to sleep.
Yeah.
That's actually probably your first call to action, is make sure if you want to weave activism into every aspect of your life that you get lots of sleep.
Difficult to achieve.
Yeah, I know. So first, I love movies, and I go to the movies all the time. And it's interesting because Hollywood is not a great place for progressive thinking. It's really not. But I really want to be able to enjoy movies. I want to be able to go to movies to be entertained, but I also don't want to feel like movies are dog whistling to white nationalists. So first we're going to talk about Avengers Endgame. I mean, I really feel at this point that everyone's probably seen it, so we're not spoiling the movie for anyone, but just in case you're like one of those people who feels like you need a spoiler warning for something that I'm like, I mean, it's like it's the highest grossing film of all time. The likelihood that you've seen it is high, but
also the likelihood that it's 2019 and someone's like, it's totally on my list, don't say anything.
Yeah.
That seems low.
Yes. But that being said, pew, 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 spoiler warning. This is your official spoiler warning.
That was officially the best, like, human voice impersonation of that weird...
Blowhorn?
Yeah, it's like a mimetic sound effect.
Pew, 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 pew!
Yeah.
So, spoiler warning. But the reason that I want to bring up Endgame is because there are some really damaging philosophies and really damaging things that come up in Endgame. The very first one being what happened in the first part of that series, which is that Thanos, evil purple panini chin man, has come. I'm telling you, once you see a panini on his chin, you'll never unsee it. And I don't know who to credit for that meme on the internet, but that was brilliant.
Choice hot take there, whoever you were.
Thanos comes to Earth and he's like, I'm going to half the population of the universe after I get all of these shiny jewels in my glove. And his reasoning is that he believes that if he halves the population of all living things, that we will not run out of resources.
Never mind the fact that living things are resources. There's a lot of... Can we first talk about that? Because first of all, is it like... Does he also kill half the cats?
He does. He kills half the cats.
But he says... Isn't there... Okay, from what I remember, it's like he kills half of all sentient life.
Yes. But
so we at least don't have to deal with the fact that if he killed half of all of the bacteria, we'd be really, really screwed. But... we still end up screwed in this scenario.
Well, it is absurd because if it is all living things, so that includes bacteria, plant life, then the resources are gone. So you're right back to square one anyway.
Yeah.
And one of the things that came about from this stupid idea he has is people started talking about Thanos having a point. And the reason, I mean, first of all, Bradley Cooper said Thanos had a point. So Bradley Cooper...
he's a big dummy.
But Chris, maybe you can speak a little bit to why this myth that if we get rid of, let's say, even half of humanity, that's somehow going to help. Because overpopulation is not the issue here facing the death of our planet.
Okay, so... the myth of overpopulation goes back to another big dummy in history. His name was Thomas Robert Malthus, and he's the one who coined the, I think it's referred to as the Malthusian crisis. He assumed back in, let me just... check my notes here. Right. So he was born in 1766, died 1834, and in his lifetime, the probably not so well calculated population increases in the world led him to jump to the conclusion that the population of humans on Earth was going to just keep growing exponentially and totally out of control, and that this major crisis point was going to happen where basically the Earth's ability to provide food was going to be entirely outpaced by how many hungry mouths, specifically of human beings, were going to exist. And there are an awful lot of people who believe that this is the problem today. Anytime you talk to someone who is mentioning, the problem of overpopulation, they are jumping to this immediate assumption that really the problem that we face on Earth is that we can't grow enough food, and that's why there are so many starving people in the world. However, if you actually look at a chart that shows you how much raw food mass we make on Earth and how many joules of energy are in that food, when it's made, and then you look at the number of people, we actually make far more food than what human beings alive right now would need to survive. We are currently making roughly estimated about enough food for 10 billion people, even though we only have, 7.2 billion, 7.3, something like that right now. And the major problem is that much more than even that excess food is wasted because it is less profitable to use better systems to get that food to starving people than it is to just waste food in the production of fancier food and restaurants and give it only to the people who have money.
So not only do we currently have the resources capable to feed every single mouth on planet Earth,
yes,
the only thing stopping that food from being equitably distributed to every single person on Earth is money.
It's capitalism. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's people who wield the kind of power to make the choices to have the food. And certainly there are enough wealthy people in control of the food sources that you're talking about who could maybe take a minor pay cut for the sake of distributing that food in a more equitable manner.
Yes. And I do like to attack billionaires at any possible opportunity because none of them should exist. There shouldn't be anyone with $1 billion or more to themselves individually. And unfortunately, there's a sizable group, although they are definitely the minority, who do have that. However, we also have to not necessarily just point the finger at individuals, because the real problem is systemic. It's that our system is entirely built around, profit motivation only.
And I think the other thing that's related to this very specific ideology that's so problematic is the idea that humans are pests. This is a theme that I see pretty consistently on film, especially when they want to tackle, the issue of inequality or a lack of equity. They discuss humans as pests, as if humans ourselves, for procreating, for taking care of children, for raising children, is somehow the big issue because we spread like pests. But that's not the case. The thing that is so insidious, the thing that is destroying the planet, the thing that spreads like a pest that we cannot seem to control is industry. It's industry that's cutting trees down. It's industry that is destroying perfectly viable resources for the sake of, oil production or corporate farming that's not sustainable. And this is not ultimately what so many people who are trying to stop those things, stop industry and slow industry down so that we can keep a sustainable planet, is they're saying, like, we don't need the oil and we don't need this type of farming. What we need is sustainable farming. What we need is sustainable food sources, and what we need is sustainable energy sources. So we don't need to be destroying the planet the way that we are in order to support and have a technologically advanced and viable society, a society that is fed properly and that has a quality of life that is sustainable throughout history.
Well, there's one thing I'd like to bring up. There are an awful lot of environmentalists these days who are saying that some of the linguistic changes that we need to make when we're talking about climate change is we need to drop the word sustainability, because sustainability is a friendly word for making everyone believe that we can maintain the status quo. And one of the major problems is, in order to curb the greenhouse gas emissions, we have to stop burning fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. And stopping burning fossil fuels actually does take a big bite out of what we experience now. And one of the things that people don't really want to talk about is that the status quo right now is not sustainable, period. So there are no sustainable practices until we have like a probably rather painful revolution in power generation and power distribution, just energy, period. There's going to be that painful transition. And then maybe we can start getting ourselves back to, the sort of society that we experience right now. And one of the funny things, too, is that a lot of the people who demonize socialism, and let's try to also remember that we're trying to get back to Thanos and how big and dumb Thanos is in that movie, or in those two movies. Yeah, Panini Chin there. But a lot of the people who demonize socialism and communist values often will go after what they call government handouts or welfare, which I really wish more people would remember is a word that is actually synonymous with well-being. So when you hear welfare, that should not be something that makes you kind of recoil in the same way that like well-being should not make you upset. But they go after the idea of government handouts as if free money and free resources would stop people from wanting to achieve things. And it struck me the other day that, first of all, it has been demonstrably proved through various regional experiments in basic income, like pilot projects, that most people actually decide to start a business or go back to school. So they actually become more productive. However, I realized the other day that the argument that people would stop doing things is also a bad argument, because right now what we're facing in terms of the size of this like global catastrophe of climate change would be greatly aided if loads of people decided to do absolutely nothing. Like, if the vast majority of society was so comfortable that they were like, I'm just going to be sedentary and read books and go for walks, we would almost immediately lower the number of people who are in their cars like 2 hours to work, 2 hours back, sitting in traffic jams, just generating lots and lots of emissions. And that doesn't necessarily address immediately the fact that actually the majority of those emissions are coming from industry, but gradually that would lead to less industry being needed, because far fewer people would be going to these like, make work, like busy task jobs that don't accomplish anything.
Well, this is also an interesting thing you've brought up, because another really horrifying aspect of Endgame that was throughout the film was this one big fat shaming joke of Thor, as well as this shame that they consistently exerted on him, or tried to exert on him, because he had PTSD. And this relates to what you're saying, because lots of people believe that that it's a complete myth that people who are fat are lazy, that people who have PTSD and who can't snap out of it are somehow not hardworking people who contribute to society.
Yeah.
And that Thor making this choice to isolate himself and play video games, and his body is now changed, makes him a bad person. That was so consistently communicated throughout the film. And everybody should be horrified at that for myriad reasons. The first being that, this was a missed opportunity in many ways, because I have no problem with having a fat superhero. In fact, I think it's such a travesty that we don't have fat superheroes, because there are lots of fat superheroes literally in the world. It's a myth that somebody's shape of their body would contribute to their physical prowess or their ability.
Especially considering he's a god.
Well, and not only that, but in the end of the film, ultimately his power is unchanged by his physical body. His physical body looks different, and yet he still wields Mjolnir. He's still able to wield the power of lightning. He still has superhuman strength. So nothing about his strength has changed by his physical body, because his power comes from within. And if there's one thing we need to stop doing, is making people feel less powerful because of how their body looks. Your body has no ability to change the power that you wield inside of you. Not to mention that then they correlate his body shape with PTSD, and that's not necessarily true. Like, someone's mental health is related to how they feel inside, and you can't automatically change someone's mental health if their physical body changes. It's just like, people can work out and end up looking like Chris Hemsworth looks, but their minds can still be hurting and their hearts can still be hurting. You have to change those things first. You can't just automatically tell someone, like, because they consistently tell him that in the film, like, you need to lose weight, or you need to stop eating, or they food shame him constantly too. And food should never be shamed. We are allowed to eat whatever the fuck we want.
Yeah, Yeah, if Thor needs, like, some chips to get over, like, major emotional trauma, I think that's okay.
Well, not only that,
Holy shit.
It's just that his entire existence became this one big shaming moment. There are so many terrible implications with that. Not to mention that they showed so little compassion and empathy for post-traumatic stress disorder, including literally smacking him in the face and telling him to snap out of a panic attack that he's experiencing because he's about to interact with his dead mother. Like, these are... The thing about science fiction and supernatural stuff and superhero movies is that it does pose... You can ask big questions about things that really exist in the world, like post-traumatic stress disorder, with sort of extraordinary circumstances. But it's something that we're all supposed to relate to. And in a moment where I felt I could maybe relate to Thor because I have post-traumatic stress disorder, that I've had to work at mitigating my symptoms, instead I was like, oh, right, so the world thinks that I really am just a big whiner, that I'm whining about the trauma that I've experienced. And when you really look at the trauma that Thor has experienced in the course of the movies, his mother has died, his father has died, his sister turned out to be a genocidal maniac, so he had to kill her. His brother has died.
His brother was murdered.
His brother was murdered in front of him. His brother also went through his whole other, another genocidal, like, period of his life where he had to try to rehabilitate him. And then his people had to escape their planet in order to survive, and then half of them were murdered by Thanos. So he's lost his culture, his ethnicity, his, so many things, and he's told to snap out of it. I mean, it's absurd. And then when you compare that to Hawkeye's narrative, Hawkeye, who loses his family, becomes a mass murderer and experiences instant forgiveness.
Yeah.
Instant forgiveness.
And also allegedly just snaps out of it.
Yeah.
Because later they have that scene where they, like, give him a shot on screen to roll his eyes at how Thor is behaving.
Yeah.
This is a guy with a bow and arrow.
Yeah.
And he's like,
yeah,
this God who's experienced all these awful things that we've all gone through is being such a big baby.
Yeah.
And I want to get back to Thanos before we do this, but we need to tee off on fucking actual Jeremy Renner, because that, even just him, the way he responds to losing his family is so, like, horrifying when it comes to the details of his fucking life right now. But anyway.
Yeah, he becomes a vigilante assassin who commits mass murder under the guise that he's protecting people. But, like, one of the dangerous things about vigilantism in superhero movies is so often it has to be important that they aren't killing people. I mean, Jessica Jones, again, spoiler alert for people who haven't finished watching season 1 of Jessica Jones, her turmoil is in finally killing the bad guy because she doesn't feel that she has the right to wield her power over people in that way, even though he is so bad. Like, she's essentially forced into a situation where she kills him. But that should be a huge moral question for superheroes who choose vigilantism. Spider-Man never kills. He always hands the quote-unquote bad guys over to the cops, right? Like, there has to be some moral compass there. And Hawkeye decides to kill gangs. And, especially if we get into the nuances of how people end up in gangs and the kind of sociopolitical situations that result in gang membership, he's really killing people that have the opportunity to change. He's committing murder.
Yeah. He's enacting corporal punishment.
Yes.
And totally unjustifiably, because he's not, like, giving any of these people access to justice or like he's not going to each one of them. Is like, before I run you through with this fucking sword thing that I've decided is going to be the way that I'm killing everybody. How about I ask you about your background and like where you grew up, and did you have a chance to go to post-secondary, etc., etc.
Yeah, but how does he know that someone isn't a child soldier who's been conscripted into some kind of gang membership?
Like, he doesn't. But again, we're talking about the presumptions in the movie that are very troubling. And to get back to one, there's an awful lot about the two movies that does not challenge Thanos' assumption that this particular attack, this action will somehow have a positive influence. Everyone in the movie who is not killed in the snap is sad, but we don't actually see how, first of all, removing half, let's even just say it's only the people, right? Only human beings. If we suddenly went from 7.2 to 3.6 billion people, everyone would suffer immensely, even if they didn't know anybody who disappeared. Because you have to think about like the necessary portions of how the world works that would suddenly come to a screeching halt. Like, let's say you had a job that was like the most important job in the world. Let's say that half of the farmers are gone.
Yeah.
Half of the doctors are gone. Half of the firefighters are gone. But the world itself doesn't like suddenly shrink to half its size for things like communication, and they really went out of their way in the movie, like the 5 years later in the second movie, to show that they were still driving around in like brand new cars.
Yeah, so for advertising sake.
Like, yeah, they have this like concept car that they show up to Iron Man's like cabin in the woods with.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay,
that's not what would happen.
So industry just kept chugging through, even though suddenly half of their customers and half of their designers and half of their factory workers just disappeared. Like, it just doesn't
make
work.
Sense.
It doesn't work at all. Plus, there's another problem with it, in that the 7.2 billion human bodies are not making physically all of the pollution and all of the plastic, etc. We've got all of those problems right now. That is this very big amount of momentum that has been put toward the problems that we are currently facing and are going to have to face in the future. And obviously nobody wants to talk about these things, but again, those problems don't get solved just by cutting out half of the human beings. It is the worst answer to the problem, because one of the problems right now is, let's say everybody stopped driving, which according to the movie is not what happens.
No.
If everybody stopped driving, we would still have to come up with some technological solutions for instance, one of the most recently discovered problems that I really hope everybody gets a chance to read about is that it turns out that with the amount of warming that we've already gone through on the globe, the ocean, now that it is slightly warmer, surprise, surprise, it, for whatever reason, absorbs less CO2 than it did before that level of warming. So we now need a technological solution that starts the cooling effect, because that one particular feedback loop means that the ocean absorbs more heat, but less of the greenhouse gases that are helping to create the increased heat. So if it starts absorbing less, and that leaves more of it in the atmosphere, even if we all stopped doing everything right now, we have a machine on Earth that is working toward greater warming, which might also, unfortunately, quadruple the rate of warming, which means we're facing very major problems, and we need all hands on deck.
Yeah, and this might be a good time to actually segue into, I just want to quickly talk about Terminator Dark Fate. First of all, well, because Terminator movies have consistently had this theme of, the impending apocalypse, right? That eventually AIs would take over the planet, kill humanity, and we would rise up and try to fight back. And again, spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't seen the film, and I'll try my best not to spoil it, because one of the things I want to say is that, first of all, Linda Hamilton was fucking amazing in that movie. She was so badass. It is so wonderful to see an elder woman kicking ass in an action movie. We need so much more of her in the world, so many more women given the opportunity to act like that. I love her. She's amazing. But it brings me to a line that really busted my balls in that movie. I think based off of the trailers, people can see that you eventually meet Arnie as a Terminator in the movie. And I'll just tell you, he has an arsenal of weapons, okay? Like a ridiculous arsenal of weapons, because he lives in the States. And there's a question posed to him, why do you have these weapons? And his response is that he calculated that there was a 74% chance that humans would resort to barbarism, regardless of the future not including AIs destroying humanity. Plus it's Texas. And the thing that really sucks about that is that there's this myth, again, that humans will destroy each other. And yes, it's true that we do need to all get on board with tackling the climate crisis. And it's true that if it's not all of us together, that we will be in a lot of trouble. But that being said, it is not true that we will resort to killing each other if things start to go really badly, like if shit hits the fan. And this relates to the human as pests philosophy of Endgame, because again, it hammers home this false idea that humans are pests, humans are expendable, and we don't believe in each other. And that's just not the truth. And I hope that people who are listening to this podcast realize that even though there are lots of people who let us down, we really have the capability to cooperate. We have the ability to share, and we have the ability to work together when things get really bad. And so to finish this podcast today, our very first one, yoo-hoo! I just want to leave everybody with some positivity, because obviously we've talked about some of the real issues that are facing the planet and facing humanity. That being said, we have the ability right now to change things, for us to transition to renewable energy, for us to transition as a society to change the capitalist framework that we function under. It doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. We know that capitalism is failing us. And it's so important that we constantly speak up and out about those issues. And that we historically do work together as people. We don't just fight each other. War is not inherent in us. Yes, we might have disagreements. Yes, there might be issues that we need to solve. And yes, we might have philosophical differences, but we need to embrace those things that aren't imposing our beliefs on others and allow each person to believe in what they do, while also working together for a life that will sustain all of us going forward. So yeah, humans are not pests. We're not going to devolve into barbarism. We don't have to worry about that. the truth is we are looking at a future that includes more refugees on this world, and we are not going to deny them the opportunity for safety, for equality, and for asylum.
Yes. we hope. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's, like I said, it's so important that we do it all together instead of deciding that we're not worth the fight.
You know, I saw some good advice on Twitter recently, which seems to be, you know, the billion-strong village where it's hard to remember people's names, but sometimes you get a real golden nugget. And they said when you identify a certain kind of injustice that you really are upset by, a very positive way to look at it is to first acknowledge that it can change. Secondly, to look for who is already working on fixing that injustice. Because that, as one really uplifting thing, is that there are already people out there who probably feel exactly the same way you do about something. If it feels like a big major issue to you, you're probably not alone. Mm-hmm. And third, to see how you can offer help to those people and those organizations.
Yeah, and very importantly, you know, when we talk about the future of this planet, it's been proven time and time again that when territories that are run by the indigenous people that have been living there, you know, forever, when their governance is reinstated, when their culture is allowed to thrive, and when they are the ones in charge of overseeing and stewarding that territory and that land, consistently, an overwhelming percentage of those areas create more sustainable. I know you're saying sustainable is not the right word, but I don't really have another word for it. But they create longevity and for the environment and for the people living in that territory. So, you know, there's a reason that environmentalists have recognized that Indigenous people and Indigenous leadership is so important when it comes to saving the planet. Speaking of that, if you visit the Unistoten Camp's website, you can donate to their legal fund. Their legal fees are consistently growing as they try to prevent industry from destroying. I mean, unfortunately, the RCMP and the Canadian military and the BC government have already forcibly occupied their lands and have started tearing down trees over a sacred warpath, including burial grounds for their people, which is extremely devastating, not only because it's destroying the environment and the ability to keep the water in that area clean, and this area is one of the last freshwater sources in British Columbia, but because this is traditional Wet'suwet'en territory, they have a right to live there, they have a right to keep the land safe, and digging up the bones of their ancestors for the sake of a pipeline is truly an act of genocide. So you can visit Unistoten Camp, you can visit their Facebook page as well as their website, donate to their legal fund, and look at all of the other action plans that you can take. This is just one faction of Indigenous folks who need your support. There are so many all over the globe, but this one I know I've been following for a long time, and I keep trying to get people who care about the environment to care about them because they are one and the same. All right. So you have a few action plans going forward. Take care of each other, cooperate with each other, love one another. Visit Unistoten Camp's website and Facebook page. Don't forget, we are not pests. We don't deserve to be treated as such. And love one another and be warriors in your own way. All right. Okay, that's it.
Bye.
Bye.